You are listening to Action Design, your monthly insight into the field of behavioral economics and its applications to the world around us. We bring you leading practitioners from all industries to discuss cutting-edge behavioral research and how to practically apply those concepts to the development of consumer products and public policy. Welcome everybody to another fantastic episode of Action Design Radio. I am your co-host today, Zach Simon, along with Erik Johnson.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us once again.
Yeah, and we have the pleasure of welcoming to our show Ruth Schmidt. Hello, Ruth.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Ruth, you have a little bit of a relationship with us here in the Action Design Chicago chapter. You gave a talk at one of our events earlier this year on leveraging positive friction in user-centered design. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right. I think that was back in April or so.
Yeah, fantastic. There was a great turnout for that event. So we're really excited to have you on the podcast today. But before we really get going, why don't you just introduce yourself, give a bit of background on yourself to our listeners.
Sure. No, fair enough. You should know who you're talking to here. As Zach mentioned, my name is Ruth Schmidt, and I am currently a visiting industry professor at in the Institute of Design here in Chicago. We actually just moved to main campus, so that's kind of exciting in that neck of the woods. But what I do there primarily is I teach a couple of different varieties of classes. Some a little bit less relevant to this conversation is more around communication design and theory, since communication is a really important part of design. But my primary teaching and also sort of research and methodology interest is around behavioral design. So I've taught classes there as an adjunct for about 10 years in that field. And essentially, when I say behavioral design, I should clarify, because I know that term gets used a bunch. It's taking behavioral economics principles and applying them to user-centered design. So, being a design school, obviously, we teach a lot of different methodologies and tools and techniques and ways of thinking about designing. And when I came across behavioral economics back in the day, this was 2008-ish, it seemed so ripe and so relevant for understanding people. I mean, at its core, that's what it is. It's like a different way of understanding why people do what they do or don't do what they say they're going to do, all that kind of stuff. So that's the role I have now, and I'm sort of actively doing research and whatnot, but also teaching. In fact, I just finished a behavioral design course earlier this morning. Students gave their final presentations about applying, again, sort of behavioral design to projects that they're working on, or even to kind of diagnose their own behavior in their own lives.
We should have done a live podcast of them sharing their final projects.
It was 3 hours long. I don't know if the listeners.
You got to really be interested in that one, yeah.
It's like a Dan Carlin episode. Hardcore history is like 5 hours a piece, easy.
Yeah. We're on long form now, yeah.
But actually, I should also say, so right now I talked about my educational and sort of my academic hat. I also spent, during the time I was an adjunct, I spent about 8 or 9 years at Doblin, which is an innovation group within Deloitte, currently within Deloitte. So there I was an innovation person. I came in as a designer, but I applied all of the things that we're likely to talk about today to innovation projects and to user-centered cases there. And what was kind of exciting about that, I mean, I came in with this whole sort of host of knowledge about behavior and how we should apply it. And it became clear at a certain point, well, it's sort of silly to just do that in an ad hoc way. So one of the things that we were able to do at Doblin was I led a small team in developing some tools and methodology and whatnot. So it sort of took, sometimes behavioral econ can sound like a bunch of, party tricks, cocktail conversation about biases. But we tried to kind of yank it into a real life application. So, when we would have a client, it was something that we could use to solve their problems better.
Yeah, I know that you mentioned Doblin, and I believe we had at least one Action Design Chicago event there within the last year. I think it might have been back in January. So yeah, definitely familiar with them. I know that you did a lot of work for them in, behavioral design, integrating behavioral economics with user experience, UX, a lot of de-risking innovation and increasing user adoption kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that idea of de-risking, I think, was kind of a key thing there. whatever technique you use, whether it's design or behavioral science, like nothing is a silver bullet. You can't solve everything all the time. But you can de-risk certain things if you know better ways of approaching and at least kind of covering your bases and understanding why people are likely to derail. The way I often explained it both to my colleagues and clients, it's like you can have ideas that are super smart on paper, but aren't going to work in the real world because sometimes something as tiny as, asking somebody to create a new username and password is enough to have them not adopt, your website or sort of look for more information. So thinking about behavioral design is a way to say like, hey, let's pressure test and give a sanity check and kind of apply some really smart understanding about why people behave in certain ways or how they process information. That can only be helpful. It won't always, solve every single thing, but it means that we're smarter about what we're doing.
Definitely, yeah. The de-risking is something I've tended to use in my work as well. And that I find whenever you talk about reducing risk, business people tend to listen.
Totally.
Usually. So that's you got to speak the language people speak. So speaking of that, and speaking the language people speak, and think about definitions. So there's a ton in reading your past work and just in you covering kind of what you've done here just now. There's a ton we could dive into, but I kind of want to start in a little bit more the design side of things because, you have this interesting intersection between the design communities and kind of the behavioral science communities. And I think, for our listeners and for, myself and personally, I kind of get the definitions when it comes to behavioral science and things like that. But, to me, I guess design in some ways is sort of a vague entity to me. And thinking of how those intersect. So when you talk about things like design and design thinking, how do you kind of think about those as far as defined as industries and practices and, how are they different than what you would typically consider behavioral science or behavioral science design?
Yeah, no, and it's a wonderful question because design is the kind of thing where we all have seen designed things in the world, right? We all have iPhones in our pockets or, we see interior design that we like or graphic design that moves us. So the word design means a lot of stuff, and it's probably every designer's worst nightmare at a wedding or something. What do you do? And you say you're a designer. And you're like, oh, really? Fashion design? It's no, look at me. Why would you think that? So one sort of metaphor that I like to use sometimes to help explain what design is in a broad way is that if you think about playing cards, somebody has to design the actual deck of cards, right? That's it's the usability factor. It's can you shuffle them well? And are the suits distinguishable? So things like that are a little bit more about the form factor or about things like what we, might consider UX design. How do we actually build the stuff that makes us able to do all the other things that we do? The kind of design that I talk about or that I do, which is sometimes called strategic design, is a little bit more how do we even think about playing cards? If we have two people, we'll design differently. If we have four people, that's a different situation. Then we can play bridge. We can start to build out what is it that we are actually even sort of what's possible. Design is often defined by how you think about the constraints and what are the things that we need to design around. But it's also broader than stuff and artifacts. So we design things like experiences, or we think about, well, how do you create a service? When something like iTunes, part of the reason it works really well is because there's a lot of design that went on in the background to get agreement about rights and about sort of how you can access songs in a different kind of way. So design in that case is a little bit more about we would design differently if we're playing gin rummy or crazy eights. We can think about creating, bridge leagues. We can start to create what are sometimes called platforms. And I don't want to get too far down that road because design, again, becomes its own Pandora's box of crazy. But it's essentially sort of taking sort of things that are not just artifacts, but how do we craft a whole experience and set of services around stuff so that people can better do what they want to do. And the reason why user-centered often gets attached to design is because essentially when you're designing stuff for people, if you're not considering those people, then you're kind of leaving out a really big part of the equation. So if you're only thinking about designing and technology, well, you've designed a great thing, but that doesn't mean that anyone's going to find it that useful. So the way that we sort of think about it attached to behavioral science is that if behavioral science is kind of understanding the biases and how people think, the heuristics, all the sort of cognitive load that is going on and cognitive issues, you also have all the things around people design. So what is my identity like? right? What are the things about my past experience that I bring to the table that maybe I interpret things differently only because I've had an experience 10 times already versus coming at it the first time. So that user-centered piece of the design kind of helps us to fill in that part of the picture, I would say. It's a little bit more the context setting, but that's why I always find that they create a really nice kind of complementary pair because they're coming at people just from different directions.
Yeah, thank you for going into that a little bit. I know that's one of the first things that we wanted to ask. No, it's one of the first things that we wanted to ask you, just because, like you said, people throw terms around like design, or especially these days, a very big buzz term is design thinking, and it's just like well, what exactly does that mean? You're the design professional, so getting you to break it down in layperson terms definitely helped. Because I know Matt Wallert, the chief behavioral officer at Clover Health, he was, I think, our very first guest on the podcast a year ago. And I remember one of his quotes was just like, just stop telling me about your fancy design thinking and just tell me what you've built and what the metrics are so I can understand. So the article that you just wrote with Sarah Reed for behavioralscientist.org, we'll definitely link to that article on our website so our listeners can check it out in full for themselves. But behavioralscience.org or behavioralscientist.org, it was part of a series that you wrote on Nudge Turns 10, right? Yeah, so Richard Thaler, Cass Sunstein, they write Nudge 10 years ago. It's a big sensation, and now it's 10 years later. So people like yourself are, contributing to the website and writing articles like, okay, it's been 10 years, it's been a decade. Where are we taking the field now? How are we building on what they've already set forth? And so you wrote a lot about incorporating strategic design into the behavioral economics domain, or kind of, quote, taking nudges to the next level. We were hoping you could give us some examples, just so our listeners could actually really sink their teeth into some tangible examples of, how so? How do you mean?
Sure. And maybe even backing up just a little bit, part of, I think, what made that sort of what prompted that whole article was that Sarah and I, she's a former colleague, and we've been having many conversations around stuff like this because we're proudly nerds in this area. And one of the things that
Join
we were reflecting on, I know, we're all
this podcast is for the nerds. Yes.
But given the 10-year anniversary, one of the things that she and I talked about was that, to what extent is behavioral economics, or nudging in particular, almost a victim of its own success? So, it's great that it's 10 years old and it's actually gotten a ton of traction, right? You say the word nudge now and people know what you're talking about. I'd say 10 years ago, not so much.
Sure.
But it also meant that maybe because of the success in addressing certain types of problems that are very much around, like, here's a behavioral challenge and here's a way of thinking, how to nudge people into a different kind or a better kind of behavior, that maybe it was kind of aiming too narrowly, to be honest. And by looking at things that were only defined as kind of, here's a behavioral thing to solve for, especially given the nature of the work that I do, I think of behavior as incredibly important to a whole array of problems. And so I think part of what initiated the interest in writing this article in the first place and developing a bit of a model around it was that, hey, what happens if we spread that landscape out a little bit bigger? And we start with nudges, but we don't begin and end there. We actually say, well, nudges are great and important. I would never, ever, ever question that they're incredibly effective for certain types of problems. But what happens if we extend that landscape a bit broader to say, well, how can behavioral science apply to other stuff? So in a sense, like Zach, when you're talking about, how we tried to extend nudges, I think it was in that respect. And as far as addressing your actual question, what are some examples? We talk a lot, or, behavioral scientists, all of us talk about things like choice architecture, right? That's a familiar term for everyone, how you can adjust the environment so that people behave differently. But sometimes that is not sufficient, or it's not sufficient to understand why people aren't doing things. So I'll use a very specific kind of layperson example. Things like grocery shopping. We all want people to eat better. So choice architecture can help us put the good food closer, and it can mean that we, sort of prioritize that in their minds and sort of incentivize certain types of behaviors there. But it doesn't necessarily help us address questions like, well, maybe the idea of a lot of healthy food is priced by weight, not by a unit. Like, that's actually, it sounds small, but that's math to do. And if I'm maybe budget constrained, suddenly that's a reason for me not to, even if the choice architecture is beautifully done, it means that I may not go for it. right? Or maybe I don't have recipes. Maybe, cauliflower is on sale, but I have no idea what to make. Like, that's another great reason to not do something, which again seems smart and may have all of the choice architecture in the world around it to help that. So when we talk about kind of extending nudges or broadening it out, I think one of those things is, well, how do we actually understand a little bit about the why? Why is it that people don't do things? Because the more that we understand incoming what's going on with folks, that helps us to design better so we can know how to sort of make that choice architecture smarter. And it also means that we can design sometimes for systems. Like, I do a bunch of work, or I used to and still do some in healthcare. And like, healthcare is a big, sloppy, messy system, right? I think any of us who have participated in the U.S. healthcare system knows this. So some issues can be addressed with nudges, like trying to get people to exercise more, right? We can look to all sorts of solutions, commitment contracts, et cetera. But sometimes healthcare is about choosing a good Medicare plan. And that's not something which you can necessarily, you can create, again, better choice architecture. But in research that I've done, people just sometimes are worried about not choosing the worst choice. Like, they're so worried about making a bad decision or seeming stupid or not asking the right questions. So there's a lot of depth in sort of why people don't do those types of things. And that's where, again, thinking about behavioral stuff and thinking about, like, well, what are ways that we can build interventions and broader solutions that are fully informed by that? And nudges are a part of it, but not totally sufficient.
Yeah, I think it's a relevant point, and funnily enough, like, I think last week I kind of got in a conversation like Twitter with somebody about this. So like, often, and some of it too is like a lot of these terms are very messy. Like, we don't have a like very strict definition of what exactly a behavioral economics intervention is, but it's definitely, like, to your point, like very much usually thought of as these just key decision points where like there's this point where somebody's making a decision, taking an action. How do we alter everything at that point of the action to like change behavior? When, to your point, like, often it's like, and I've just found this myself in like learning more about, when I kind of first started learning about this stuff, a lot of it is just behavior change broadly. Like, why is it so hard to like eat vegetables every day, or like something simple like that, And, I just found, just personally for myself, and the more I've read about this stuff, that it's usually not about just that easy choice. It's usually a lot deeper kind of thing. Like, it could just be an identity issue. It could just be a physical health issue. Like, if something's out of whack in your kind of, physical health, a lot of decisions are hard, regardless of the choice architecture, because you're just sluggish, you're not operating 100%, things like that. So it sounds like you're kind of like emphasizing, and a lot of this, I think it sounds like comes from your background design of like, how do we think past just that point of the decision itself and everything that's happening there, and look more to kind of to the more user design perspective, just like what's going on in that person's life that's also motivating what's happening.
Yeah, and that context piece I think is super duper important. And actually there was just, I don't know, within the past month, maybe 2 months, very recently, I feel like there was a lot of flurry in the Twitter universe about organ donation, right? There was some research that people were suddenly talking about where, like, oh my God, if you have organ donation, which has been proven like repeatedly, that increases, if you have a system where people have to opt out of donating their organs, it tends to like radically increase the number of people who sign up.
Just a simple default. Yeah.
Exactly. So tiny, like the small barrier of not having to choose makes an enormous difference. But what they found, I believe it was in the UK, was that when families override that, because in some cases they have the option to override the donor's decision, it was actually less effective to be a default donor because families interpreted that as like, well, that wasn't really a choice. That's not really something they wanted to do. It was just kind of something that they didn't, it was like a non-choice. They decided to, whatever, not make the action. And so oftentimes you would find families overturning those decisions. And what I found so exciting and really like fascinating that was like, they're kind of proving my point, was that there was this sense of, hand-wringing, pearl-clutching, like, oh my God, our default's not really everything they're chalked up to be. And I kind of felt like, no, the nudge worked fine. You actually converted people from non-donors to donors, but you didn't consider the context. You didn't consider the fact that, like, families can overturn this. Well, design for that, not just the fact that you've converted somebody into being a donor by a default or an opt-out situation. So it's a kind of an example, and a very, it's a very familiar one, because I think all of us probably use organ donation as an example of defaults and opt-out, where you have to consider the fuller set of circumstances if you're really going to sell stuff.
Yeah, and it kind of goes to like, a lot of these decisions are part of very complex systems of decisions where like we make one decision that has ramifications for all these other things. And, part of me is, as we're kind of talking, I wonder if some of this kind of revelation comes from having more of kind of that business applied setting because, as I was reading your article, I was like, there was things, as you were talking about thinking further past just the point of the decision and like the ramifications and all these kind of things. So I was like, it's the same sort of thing that I know I've kind of been forced to come to in working in kind of an industry setting where you're trying to like, you maybe have a broader business metric you're trying to drive. And in kind of the traditional behavioral economics and even just like, I work in kind of a lot of the optimization and testing, so I run a lot of experiments. And even I find in just sort of the like digital marketing industry, people tend to focus on this one point of an A/B test. Where like, look at what we did in this email to increase opt-ins or increase click-throughs by 45% with this similar thing. They never ever show you what that actually means for like the business. It's like, all right, like you got a lot of people click on an email, but like, did that affect your revenue at all? Like, what did that actually drive? And I found that a lot just working individually with people is that like people get so focused on those little isolated decision points that are very easy to measure and very easy to play around with. And like, oh, let's play with the button color again. It's like maybe blue will work this time, and not considering that whole context. And like, I don't know, like if that's kind of your experience. I'm assuming that's kind of your experience as well. Maybe we'd draw this out, but it seems, and what I've kind of learned is that it's very unnatural for people to think in a broader context, I guess. And it's just like, and it makes sense. It's just psychologically easier to drill down to that one point of a process and just optimize the hell out of that without worrying about the rest of it.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And I've seen that again and again. And in fact, what's interesting is that it kind of works in both directions. So what you're describing, totally familiar, where, right, like it's kind of like, okay, well, we proved this and now what? And it's almost like looking towards the future about revenue, ROI, et cetera, all those business things that are important. What I've also found that people sometimes neglect is like, well, what would happen to all those people who derailed much earlier because they didn't even try your product? Yeah. So as an example, I mean, I've done a bunch of work in financial services in addition to healthcare. And we did a bunch, this was years ago, but I've seen it sort of play out in other situations too, where we were basically asking people like, what can we do to help long-term financial planning? Like we all know that's a super hard thing to do because it's abstract and future tense. It's like a perfect storm of things that make it hard. But one thing that we heard repeatedly was that a lot of people were like, oh, financial advising or financial advisors, that's for rich people. And right there, and it's what you hear that once. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Then you hear it from a lot of people, like young, old, well off, not so well off. And it starts to be like, so you could create a really awesome service and people are not even going to touch it or even think that it applies to them because they've decided that that's for other people. So what you're describing is really interesting too, because it kind of assumes that people are that far down the funnel where like the mindset that they have and even their ability to choose certain things that they've already sort of jumped a bunch of steps. And that's not always true. So I have this fascination sometimes with like non-participants, so to speak. Like who are all the people that aren't even part of the story?
That's
right?
That's kind of your natural control group. It's just like, why is there this population of people that are just choosing to not even get into the pool here?
Yeah, like they checked out before you even measured anything about that blue button versus a green button. So that's part of it too. I think there's actually an interesting design framework that it's not unique to either Doblin or ID, but it's about making a compelling experience. And essentially it's about exactly what you're describing. Like, don't just look at the action because that's an exciting moment, but you also have to think about like, well, what attracted somebody in the first place? How did they enter the situation? How did they leave it? And how do you extend it? And what I've actually done and used, and I teach in my class, is like there's a behavioral version of that too. So if somebody's, recycling is sort of a great example. Somebody can have a mindset like, absolutely, I believe in recycling, but recycling is so damn hard sometimes. Like the deck is stacked against you, where even if you really, really believe in recycling, you're often not likely to do it. And then if you don't believe in recycling and it's hard, then like, again, you've sort of checked out of that whole process. So if you think about that same kind of beginning to end entry through extension, and from a behavioral standpoint, you can start to see, well, where are people derailing, right? It's where you can start to capture back like, oh, well, if we hadn't had them have to set up a username and password, just to use my previous example, maybe we would have gotten more people on board, right? So you're always checking like what users are going to respond to and also the needs of the business. I think that's a really, really important equation. It's not just about people.
Yeah, in some ways that can feel overwhelming because it's literally never ending. It's just like you work on one thing and then you find there's another piece of the process. But like that's what improvement is when it comes down to it. And that's it's easier to think about that one point. But when you start looking at the full funnel and always like of whatever the action is and the whole system involved, like it's kind of never ending, which can be exciting or daunting. But eventually you got to tackle it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Eric, you definitely reminded me of Kristen Berman when we did an episode with her a few months back about, kind of creating a behavioral product manager, a BPM, if you will. And, what she was talking about is like, oh, great, this new initiative, it drove up clicks on our emails or it drove, more activity to the website. Did that actually affect our bottom line? Did that affect revenue? Do we know that they're using the website in the way that we want them to? It's like, well, what comes next? It's like that doesn't necessarily mean that you've achieved what you're trying to achieve. So you guys definitely just reminded me of that whole concept.
It's the vanity metrics. It's just it's so easy to measure stuff now that we just measure what's easiest and try to get creative with it. And it's like, well, there's really
confirmation.
When it comes down to it, there's usually
bias. I was right.
Yeah, exactly. When it comes down from a business perspective, there's really only a few things that matter for the most part. And if you can't link your vanity metrics to those, then it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, no, and you actually just touched on like another rant of mine, which I will keep to a minimum, but just generally also like the quantification bias is something that we often see too, where it's like the things that are easy to measure are the things that get measured. So they're the things that become important because that's what you see, and therefore that's what everything plays to. And sometimes, I'm not denying that like measuring stuff, quantifying stuff, of course, those are critically important, but sometimes it can start to become this, the echo chamber sort of expertise bias of like, well, this is what we always saw, this is what we're testing for, because this is what we've seen in the past. And it may not always be, for example, it may not always be looking towards the longer term. Like coming from an innovation background, that was one of the biggest struggles, I think, with clients too, whether it was around behavior or design more broadly. You can get stuck in this cycle of like, what's the ROI, what's happening in the next quarter. And that kind of mindset can actually be it can make it very difficult for innovation to set in, because if you're so focused on what's happening 2 months from now and what's getting measured 2 months from now, it means that you're not looking for those leading metrics about, well, how do we know that we're on a course, which is going to like radically shift our company because we're kind of so focused close in. But anyway, that's a conversation for a whole other thing.
Yeah, no, and as you were mentioning that, I thought like an example that comes to mind that I think encompasses like all of this in some ways is just, consumer technology and especially like social media now. Like for years, the like winning metric that they were measured success by was like engagement. So it's just like how often are people checking it? How much time are they spending on it? And there was never real, and like that was just kind of the incentive, and like it kind of ended up making things just really addictive, and like people spending a lot of time on stuff without necessarily getting value out of it. And now I think you're starting to see the pendulum swing a little bit because there's kind of market pressure on that. But it's not that like the people building these products aren't like sitting in a lab, like evilly making these evil plans of getting people addicted to their products. But to your point, it's just like that was the relevant metric. It was easy to measure. There's always ways to do that. And everything was focused on that. And then, oh, crap, now people are addicted to our products. We don't really know what's going on with that. We're getting all this backlash about it. Now we got to like backtrack a little bit,
Yeah.
So I always think of that as a good example. Just like you got to pick the right metric. And especially if you're taking this sort of design perspective as you're looking at, like, look at the lifetime of the user itself. And if they're checking the app 10 times a day, spending 3 minutes every time, like, is that making their life better? And is that going to keep them coming back long term? Or are they just going to get sick of it eventually and have to like delete it just to prevent themselves from actually going on all the time?
Yeah. And actually, since you're bringing that up too, I mean, not to drag this down the ethics path, but there are also some really interesting questions that come into play there too, right? Like the more that we understand why people do what they do, and I would argue that people who are like well-versed in behavioral science know an awful lot. Of course, it's, again, nothing the silver bullet, blah, blah, blah. We can't like, they're not marionettes that we're making dance.
Yeah.
But an awful lot about like what causes addiction. You can create, I'm so glad the word gamification doesn't come up anymore because that started to make me insane. But,
Yeah.
How to sort of make people stick around and just do something one more time. It does start to and I also, completely recognize that businesses need to stay in business. So the idea of like clicks and users and all that, of course, like there are very real and proper reasons why that happens too. But the idea of like being thoughtful and really responsible about what we know and applying it is equally important. And there's actually there's an article, George Lowenstein, who's at CMU, who's kind of well known in the field as well, about basically like The Economist as Therapist is kind of the overall title of it, and it goes into a whole bunch of both sort of thinking about, well, what does it mean to be in somebody's best interest, right? Because a lot of behavioral economics interventions and nudges are very much about how do you save more, how do you gain better health, how do you do the things you want to do. And at its face, that is sort of an easy question, like, well, I want to do the things that are better for me. But when you start to dig into it, it's actually a pretty complicated question, because maybe the things that are great for me make your life worse, or maybe the things that suit both of us are actually bad for society, right? So again, not to like go down the same path you were just describing, where like, oh my God, where does it end? But, as designers, as behavioral scientists, as people who deal with people and designing for people in whatever form, that is something that I try to instill in my students, like the whole Spider-Man thing, right? With great power comes great responsibility. It's like,
yes,
that's what we're doing. And we have to design knowing that there's a recipient on the end, and thinking in terms of the system as well as the individual, I think is kind of an important part of all of this, whether it's clicks, whether it's health, any of this stuff.
For sure. So going back to that, with great power comes great responsibility. That just triggered, because I know, Erik has his data analysis class in about 10, 15 minutes. He's going to have to sign off. So before we come down the home stretch with our last few questions, circling back to what we were talking about a few moments ago about the default for organ donation. I think you said it was in the UK, where it turned out that there was actually a lot of families kind of like overriding the default, because it wasn't, a real opt-in. It was just the default. Everybody did it. It didn't mean that my loved one actually wanted to become an organ donor and actively decided to do it. So with that problem, that unforeseen problem or side effects to that nudge, so to speak, did that trigger anything in your design brain about here it, but that was a great term, right? Design brain. but did that trigger anything with yeah, I'm going to trademark that one. Did it trigger anything as far as like, here's something that we could use to combat that, so that maybe the family override wouldn't happen? I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any like, here's the solution, but certainly what it means if I were a designer and I was now thinking like, how do I start to sort of solve this bigger problem? One is that you have to understand a little bit more about sort of that circumstance of the family, right? And I'm not saying, oh my God, you need to visit every single person in every single family, but like, what are the things that may sort of make it feel like, that was more of a desired choice, right? So part of what you can start to think about is sort of that larger context. What are the things that are, the nudge still worked, we know that's the case, but how do we start to understand, like, what are the things that would make it more likely for a family to sort of decide that's true, or decide that that's something which is positive? So that can start to take different types of forms, right? So to a certain extent, you can start to understand, well, what are the uncertainties around something? And I'm not, by the way, at all by any means saying like, this is like now a new education platform. I think that's actually one of the mistakes that people often make. It's like, we'll just tell them more about the right thing to do, because that tends to sort of shut people down immediately. But helping, things like, rather than it just being sort of opt-in, opt-out, for example, there may be ways in which, maybe, and I'm not saying this is the best solution, just like throwing things out there, maybe if you opt in, like, or if you decide to become a donor through the opt-out mechanism, so now you're there, maybe it sends a letter to you, which you can show people, right? Like, you still haven't done that much. It's now, and again, that's not like a great idea, but what it can start to identify are like, well, what are ways that we don't let the action or the intervention, now that a family comes in, when it's almost too late, right? There are ways in which we can understand, and again, not educate, but create a little bit of a broader system around, well, what are the influences, what are the values that somebody has? One of the things that has I've actually done some work with an organ donation organization, so I've had a little bit of insight into this too. One of the
little inside baseball here.
Like just coincidentally. One of the interesting things there too that they really kind of were excited about learning more is just even things like hot and cold state. Right, when you have people coming in and somebody is now in an organ donation situation, you can only imagine, right? Like emotions are heightened. It's very stressful. You don't understand what's going on. So,
and that's definitely that's the last thing they probably want to be thinking about at that
moment. Yeah. Right. Yeah, you got to keep bedside manner in mind when you're dealing in these situations for sure.
Yeah. So the rational approach of like, oh, well, this was they agreed to be a donor, or even statistics, right? Those may not work. Something that may work at that moment is, what if you had like a wall of people who had been donors and you could see the people that they ended up donating to. So now you can kind of see like, oh, this person lived on, right? Like we heard that messages like that were actually important, that your loved one or this person who's now died now lives on in other people. So there are ways in which, again, like neither of those is going to solve everything. I hope that's clear. But ways in which, both like what are after effects of a choice that can then at least sort of help to convince, or in that hot state moment where a family has to decide, there may be ways in which they can also be they can understand or be swayed. That emotional component, I think, can't be overlooked. Whether it's organ donation or other things, I think, it's sort of a known thing that we often make decisions emotionally and rationalize them later. So let's understand that. This is, in particular, a very emotional situation. What does that start to suggest?
Yeah, one thing to think about with that, too, is, like we said, it can be sort of never-ending, and it's like, but as long as this really is like the scientific process, it's just like, it does kind of never end. Like, and as long as you're keeping this sort of more combination of design, behavioral science, like broader perspective, like, yeah, even if you do all the planning and scenario modeling in the world, like there's still going to be unforeseen effects, like something like this that you might have, we spent forever thinking about all the possible ways it could go wrong, and we still didn't see this one coming. And that's just kind of how science works, and then you apply it to the next stage of the process. It's just another problem solved.
Yeah,
so you kind of have to relish that, I think.
Yeah, and that idea, sometimes the term, it probably goes beyond design, but unintended consequences is sometimes what we talk about too. So yeah, like you see those where you can, and then, one of the things that designers do as well, which may feed into this too, is the idea of iterative prototyping. So I know that can be a little bit different from like the randomized controlled trial approach, where like you have the solution and then you have control groups and A/B testing, and these sort of like you can play things out in a more kind of, yes, rigorous way, but it also means that you have a more formulated idea of what you're testing. Something that iterative testing can do too is to sort of start putting ideas in front of people really early on. And sometimes what that can start to identify is like, oh, we thought this was going to work, but actually the root cause of whatever it was that we were testing is something very different than what we expected. So that what I see, and again, in thinking of design and behavioral science as being complementary rather than competitors, is that, we can use different techniques, even something as simple as testing, right? There are different ways to test an idea. So the combination of iterative testing early on to understand like, well, what's going on? What's sort of a better approach? And then once we feel like there's something pretty confident, then doing our CT that can get us, the data that we actually want to need. So that's the way in which, it's a little bit of both, I think, that solving problems sometimes requires more than one approach, basically.
Got to be flexible. Right?
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, Ruth, you actually kind of just led us to what is probably going to be our final question. I hope there's enough time to dive into it a little bit before I call it a night. But you mentioned, one has to complement the other as far as behavioral science and design go. That was literally our closing question. Like, when should one complement the other? Because you and Sarah read in your article, you have some really nice visuals that illustrate when an intervention is, behavioral science led and supported by design insights, and then conversely, when an intervention is design led and supported by behavioral insights. I don't know if we have enough time for you to give us a quick example of one or the other, or at least just answer the question, like when do you think it's best to lead by design and support by behavioral science, like, or the other way around, vice versa?
Yeah. Well, and we've talked about a bunch of things, I think, things like organ donation or whatever, which are a little bit more grounded, I would say, in like, this is a behavioral challenge, but we also need to understand context, right? So that may be a good example of something which is a little bit more of a behavioral challenge or behavioral change question. And the idea of adding design to that is to consider, like, well, what are the identities of users, and how can we actually make sure that we're accommodating that? What are ways in which we're understanding context? So again, in something like the organ donation situation. But there are plenty of situations, like the Save More Tomorrow is like the poster child of that, right? Like, that's a very intelligent way of helping people to save longer. And of course, like, you could probably make it even better and stronger if you had a better sense of like the context or why people choose not to dive in. On the other side, when design should lead, I think there are a lot of problems which are just more ambiguous, that are more systems oriented, for example. And I shouldn't always just phrase it as problems or challenges, actually. Like, I think Lemonade, which is the insurance product where Dan Ariely is the chief behavioral officer, right? That's a wonderful example of, that's not a behavioral science solution. That's a product and something that's out in the world as like, that's insurance. That's not just addressing behavioral change. That's actually taking into account how we think about behavior and how we can use that knowledge to actually help people, right? And to help them sort of get a product and a service which is going to suit them better. So that's a really interesting case, I think, where like clearly it has, its roots in behavioral science, or Ariely wouldn't be part of the mix. But it's also very much a design solution. Like, that's an innovation solution. I would consider that. So that's another example, I think, which is, a little further out. And it's not about solving a behavioral change problem. It's about, like, how do we just understand how behavior can help inform a variety of things? So that sense of sort of big system, multi-stakeholder, sort of how do we think about just, inventing the new. I guess another thing is we design for stuff for the future. We can't test that stuff all the time right now. So that's another place where design can be helpful. Design is actually great. It's sometimes called sort of an optimistic way of going about problem solving, because you are speculative. You're making assumptions about what's going to work. But the way that we actually close the article touches on the idea that, behavior has been persistent in humans for many generations. Just because we have iPhones in our pockets now and apps and whatever, like, we think about some of these things manifesting in a certain specific way. But I would say, like, availability, loss aversion, status quo bias, those things have probably existed for many, many years. And we'd be remiss if we didn't think about those things when we're designing for something that's, 5 years out into the future, 10 years out into the future, because those are more likely to be true than the fact that we still have iPhones around.
Gotta think bigger. It sounds like, yeah, it's hard to measure a behavior that doesn't exist yet. So
yeah,
sort of Awesome. Well, we're just about at time here. So, first of all, thank you so much for taking time with us. This was really interesting, illuminating. I think we should definitely do another one sometime soon to dive further in. But before we go, like, for our listeners, like, where can they kind of keep track of your work? Is there any, especially on the topics we've talked about, is there any kind of things books, resources, whether by you or someone else, you recommend they dive into, and to kind of continue the conversation of the topic, and just, how can they keep track of your work and learn more about you and see all the awesome stuff you're working on?
Yeah, no, let me see. Let me start there. So I am at the Institute of Design. I do have a site of my own, which is ruthkschmidt.com, which I assume we can link to somehow. So actually what that houses, which may be interesting too, are some of the sort of visualizations. I've been in this habit lately of obviously writing articles, and we do have another article coming out actually in the behavioralscientist.org site in a couple of months. That's kind of a follow-up. So that's another one. But on my site, I have a bunch of work which is kind of taking some of these ideas. Actually, Zach, you alluded to the positive friction talk I gave. Yeah. I find it really powerful sometimes, and maybe because I'm also a visual designer in addition to being a strategic designer, to actually kind of coalesce and bring a lot of these ideas together in a way that we can explore both verbally and visually. So there's some stuff there. Gosh, in terms of books, I mean, I sort of feel like I'm going to retread a lot of the ones that people are familiar with already.
Maybe they just need to hear it like the fifth time to finally get it. Yeah.
So read Think and Fast and Slow, people. Just do that. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Dan Ariely. He's got a bunch of really interesting stuff. One thing we didn't talk about, so maybe this is another time, is, how do we think about behavioral econ in relation more to technology? So like Shlomo Benartzi wrote a book, Smarter Screen, which is about kind of more like screen-based technology. I've been really interested lately on, like, how is Alexa or Siri, how are some of these technologies? I wouldn't call them robots, but how are some of the, a lot of our interactions now are mediated through technology. I would love to see a book, and maybe I'll be the one who writes it, about like, what does that start to look like? Because I think increasingly that, autonomous vehicles is an interesting example about like, that's going to change our behavior in some interesting ways. So kind of exploring some of that as well.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say you should definitely write that book.
Would you buy it?
We'll crowdfund it. Yeah. The action design. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks again so much for joining us. This was great, and I think we could continue talking about this for hours upon hours, but we've come up in our deadline for now. So
class awaits.
Definitely.
Scarcity, right? Scarcity. Yeah, can't give it all away right now.
Scarcity, absolutely. Yeah, no, let's definitely do a part 2 when you and Sarah have the next article come out. Are you co-authoring it again with Sarah?
Yep, we are.
Beautiful. We can certainly do it in the near future. Look forward to it.
That sounds great.
And if you check the Action Design website, when we post this up, we'll have links to your website, to the article, to all the other things you mentioned, and so people can check out more, and they can anxiously await the next one.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
This was awesome. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Erik. Thank you, listeners, action designers. Have a good one.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Erik Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available for download on SoundCloud, YouTube, and iTunes. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once more, that is action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States, plus Toronto. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.